The janitor's job was to move through the building without being noticed. That night, Sam Cooke noticed anyway. This is a story about what happened in the few minutes that followed, in a hallway outside a recording studio, well past midnight, in a building that by that hour was supposed to be quiet. It isn't a large story, nothing about it is large, but the man who cleaned that building carried it with him for the rest of his life, and that, by itself, tends to mean something. To understand the setting, you have to understand what a recording studio in Los Angeles looked like at that hour in the early 1960s. Not during a session, not when the musicians were setting up or the producers were listening to playback, or the label representatives were standing in the booth with their opinions, but after all of that. After the session had ended and the musicians had packed their cases and the last car had left the parking lot, and the building had passed into the particular quiet of a place that had been full of people and sound all day, and was now, finally, neither. What remained in that quiet were the people whose job it was to maintain the building between the work that happened in it. The cleaning staff moved through the same rooms where records were made, emptying the ashtrays on the mixing console, sweeping the floors of the main studio, collecting the coffee cups that accumulated on every available surface during a long session. They did this work late, after the music stopped, in rooms that still held some residue of what had happened in them, the smell of cigarette smoke and coffee, and the particular warmth that a room retains after it has held many people for many hours. The man who cleaned the studio that night had been doing this work for several years. He knew the building the way people know buildings they spend their nights in, which lights stayed on, which doors tended to stick, which rooms needed more time than others, which parts of the routine could be moved around and which couldn't. He knew which studios tended to run late and which were usually empty by 10. He had developed the particular efficiency of someone who works in spaces that belong to other people, the ability to move through a room without disturbing anything, to clean around what's there rather than touching it, to be present without being intrusive. This efficiency required a certain quality of invisibility. Not the invisibility of being ignored exactly. People saw him, acknowledged him in the way people acknowledge those who maintain the spaces they work in, which is to say occasionally and without much depth. But there was an understanding, implicit in the nature of the work and the hours in which it happened, that his presence in a room didn't constitute an interruption of whatever was happening there. He moved through the building like weather moves through a space, present, functional, unremarkable. This was the job. He was good at it. He had been doing it long enough that it had stopped feeling like something he was performing and had become simply the shape his evenings took. On this night, he had worked his way through most of the building by the time he reached the hallway outside the main tracking room. The session that had been scheduled for that studio had finished earlier in the evening, and by his calculations the room should have been empty. But as he came down the hallway, he could hear, from somewhere behind the studio's inner door, the sound of a piano. Not a playback, live piano, tentative and exploratory in the way that playing sounds when there's no one listening for it to be anything in particular. He slowed. He wasn't sure why. People sometimes came back to studios after sessions, to work through something they hadn't resolved during the main recording, to try a different approach to a part that wasn't sitting right. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't his business. He should have continued past the door, finished the hallway, moved on to the next room. Instead, he stopped. Through the glass panel set into the studio door, he could see Sam Cooke sitting at the upright piano near the far wall, playing with his left hand while his right held a small notebook. Cooke was not performing. This was immediately obvious in the way that it's always immediately obvious when a performer isn't performing. Something in the posture, something in the relationship between the body and the instrument, something in the quality of concentration that is entirely different from the concentration of a man who knows he is being watched. He was working, not rehearsing in the sense of running through something prepared, but working through something unresolved, stopping and starting, occasionally writing something in the notebook, occasionally just sitting with the chord he'd landed on as if he was waiting to see what it felt like after a moment. There was something in the way Cooke held himself at the piano, the slight forward lean, the elbow resting on the edge of the keys, that suggested he had been at this for a while already, that whatever this was had started before the janitor arrived in the hallway and would continue after he left. The notebook, the stopping, the writing, these were not the motions of a man who was about to be finished. They were the motions of a man in the middle of something he didn't fully understand yet, following a thread he couldn't see the end of, in the way that only happens when the building is empty and there is no one to perform for and no one to answer to, and the music can be whatever it actually is instead of whatever it needs to be for an audience. The janitor stood at the glass for a minute, maybe two. He was aware in the back of his mind that standing outside a studio watching Sam Cooke work was not something that fell clearly within his job description. He was also aware that the music coming through the door, muffled by glass and insulation, had a quality he had not expected from that building at that hour. Something quieter than the music he heard during sessions, something that didn't seem to be aimed at anyone. He was still standing there when the piano stopped and Cooke looked up. For a moment, neither of them moved. Cooke looked at the man in the hallway. The man in the hallway looked at Cooke. There was the glass between them, and the late hour, and the particular awkwardness of having been caught paying attention to something you weren't supposed to be paying attention to. Then Cooke nodded, not the polite, minimal acknowledgement that passes between people who see each other in hallways without any real intention of engagement, but something more deliberate than that, with enough weight behind it to carry a question. The question was clear even through the glass. "Do you want to come in?" The janitor pushed the door open. He came in a few steps and stopped, the way people stop when they've entered a room they weren't entirely sure they should enter. He still had his cleaning supplies with him. The cart was in the hallway, but he was holding a cloth in one hand in the way people hold things when they've been interrupted in the middle of a task. Cooke asked him if he'd been out there long. The janitor said no, which was mostly true. Cooke looked at him for a moment in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but didn't press it. He asked him his name. The janitor told him. Cooke told him his, which was unnecessary and which the janitor understood as a kind of courtesy, the acknowledgement that an introduction runs both ways, regardless of whether one party's name was already known. He asked the janitor if he'd heard what he was playing. The janitor said he'd heard a little through the door. Cooke said it wasn't ready, meaning the song, or the part of it he'd been working through. He said this in a matter-of-fact way, without apology, as if it was simply a status report rather than an explanation. The janitor said it had sounded good to him. Cooke looked at him for a moment and then said that was a generous thing to say, meaning it. They talked for a few minutes, not about music particularly, about the building, about the hours the janitor worked, about how long sessions usually ran and what it was like to come into a room after one had ended and try to restore it to something neutral before the next one started. Cooke asked questions the way he asked everything, directly, with what seemed like genuine interest, without the particular quality of performance that makes a conversation feel like an interview. The janitor answered them the same way, without the particular quality of deference that sometimes enters a conversation when one party is very famous and the other is not. There was something in Cooke's manner of asking that made the questions feel like they came from actual curiosity rather than courtesy. He listened to the answers the way people listen when they actually want to know what's being said, not the way people listen when they are waiting for a pause in which to say the next thing they had already decided to say. What passed between them in those minutes wasn't dramatic. It was simply conversation, the kind that happens when two people are in the same room and neither of them has anywhere more important to be. But the janitor had spent years moving through spaces where famous people worked, and he had had enough exchanges with enough of them to understand the difference between a person who was being pleasant because it was the easiest thing to do, and a person who was actually present in the room they were standing in. Cooke was the latter. You could feel it in the way his attention settled, not on the middle distance, not on some version of the conversation he had already decided to have, but on the actual room, the actual person, the actual late hour they were both in together. After a few minutes, Cooke said he should probably get back to it, meaning the song. The janitor said, of course. He turned toward the door, then paused and said something that he later described as the only spontaneous thing he said the entire time he was in that room. That he hoped the song came out well, because what he'd heard through the door had sounded like it was going somewhere. Cooke looked at him for a beat, and then nodded once, slowly. Not the polished gratitude of a performer receiving a compliment, but the quieter response of someone who had been told something he needed to hear, at the right moment, by someone with no reason to say it other than that it was true. The janitor went back out into the hallway. He finished his work, moving through the rest of the building the same way he always did, unhurried and methodical, leaving each room in the condition it was supposed to be in. Outside the tracking room, he could hear the piano again, the same tentative, searching quality as before, though now with something that sounded like it had found a slightly steadier direction. He didn't tell anyone about it when he got home. He didn't mention it to his colleagues. He had a sense that the conversation had a quality to it that didn't survive retelling, not because it was secret, but because the things that made it matter were things that couldn't be conveyed in summary. You couldn't explain, to someone who hadn't been in that hallway at that hour, why it felt the way it did. You couldn't explain what it was like to be seen clearly, by someone who had every reason not to look, in a space where being unseen was the whole point of your presence. There is something that a life built around being watched does to a person, and it doesn't always do the same thing to everyone. Some performers, after years of public attention, develop a kind of interior distance from the people around them. The attention becomes something to be managed rather than received. The public face becomes the primary face, and the private person underneath it grows quieter and quieter until it is very hard to reach. This is not a failure of character exactly. It is a reasonable response to an unreasonable set of demands, but it means that the person who walks into a room and makes a few hundred people feel completely seen is often, at the same moment, the least seen person in the building. What Sam Cooke did that night, in a studio hallway in Los Angeles past midnight, with no audience and no expectation and nothing to gain by it, was refuse that particular transaction. He looked up. He asked a name. He held a conversation as if the person he was having it with was worth the full attention of someone who had, that same evening, probably not yet finished whatever he had come back to the studio to work on. It was a small thing. It took a few minutes out of a late night that was already full of unfinished work. But the man who had cleaned that building carried it forward, and for the rest of his life, when people asked him, or when he sat quietly and thought about it on his own, what he remembered was not Sam Cooke the performer, not the voice he had heard on records, not the name on the dressing room doors he had walked past in 100 buildings. What he remembered was a man at a piano in the dark, who stopped when he didn't have to, and looked up when nobody was expecting him to, and said, "Come in." Sam Cooke finished whatever he was working on that night. The building was clean by morning. What stayed for the man who had cleaned it was simpler than any of that. A few minutes in a studio with a man who had looked up when he didn't have to, and asked a name he didn't need to know, and said thank you like he meant it to someone who was only passing through. That was all. That was enough.